17 years is a very long time in gaming. Fuck, it's a long time in anything. A person has almost grown up in that time. When Dragon Age Origins arrived in 2009, BioWare was in the middle of what we can now look back on as a golden age. Knights of the Old Republic and Jade Empire were behind them. Mass Effect had introduced an entirely new universe just 2 years earlier, and the studio had already built its reputation on games like Baldur's Gate. Then came Dragon Age Origins, and going back to it in 2026 is strange, because there's absolutely no hiding the fact that this is an old game. You notice it immediately. Faces are stiff, environments are often variations of brown and grey, animations have their unmistakable late 2000s awkwardness, and conversations frequently consist of two people standing several feet apart, staring intensely at one another for ages. Then you get into the combat. Characters shuffle into positions, weapons come out, and everyone sort of politely waits for their next attack animation. If you spent the last decade playing modern action RPGs, and the opening hours of Origins can feel almost prehistoric. But that's what happens when, like me, you decide to revisit a game nearly 2 decades after it came out. But something happens after a while. You stop caring about any of that. I know, crazy. Almost like great narrative can trump outdated gameplay or graphics. Almost. You stop thinking about how old Dragon Age Origins looks and start thinking about the decisions the game constantly asks you to make. Because yes, Dragon Age, once upon a time, was a true RPG. And that's when you realize something that really should be more obvious. The part of Dragon Age Origins that has aged the least is the part that matters the most. The role-playing. Because 17 years later, Origins still understands something that many RPGs seem to have completely fucking forgotten. Role-playing isn't simply about choosing a class or deciding whether your character fights with a sword or shoots a lightning out of their hands, or who you can fuck. Looking at you, Baldur's Gate 3, you horny bitch. It's about deciding who the person you're playing is, and then watching the world respond. And Origins begins doing that before you've even become a Grey Warden. It begins with your Oh, that's why they called it Origins. Anyway, You might be born into Ferelden's aristocracy as a human noble, surrounded by family, privilege, and political responsibility. You might begin as a city elf, living inside an alienage and immediately seeing how badly elves are treated by human society. But they do have pointy ears, so they fucking deserve it. You might be a Dalish elf, existing outside that society entirely. Become a mage, and your first experience of the world is the Circle Tower, where magic is simultaneously respected, feared, and controlled. Become a dwarf, and things change again. A dwarf noble begins close to the top of Orzammar's rigid hierarchy, surrounded by politics, betrayal, and succession. A dwarf commoner sees the same society but from the bottom, where being born into the wrong caste can determine your entire existence. These aren't simply different cutscenes before the game begins, they're stories. You meet people, you establish relationships, you experience the politics and prejudices of your culture firsthand, and then inevitably, something goes wrong. Your old life ends, and Duncan appears, beard and all. The Grey Wardens need recruits. You need somewhere to go. No, you're not the chosen one. You're someone whose life has fallen apart at exactly the moment Ferelden needs someone willing to fight. It's a simple idea, but it completely changes how the world feels. Because eventually, wherever it is you start, you come back. The dwarf noble returns to Orzammar. The mage returns to the Circle. The city elf returns to the alienage. The human noble eventually becomes entangled in the politics of Ferelden itself. And suddenly these places you started aren't just locations on a map that you visit at the beginning and never see again. They're home. They mean something to your character because you existed there before you were asked to save the world. It's difficult not to wonder why more RPGs don't steal this idea, because within its opening hour, Dragon Age has already done something many games spend 30 hours trying to accomplish, made you feel like you belong in the world. Unfortunately, the world you've been dropped into is completely fucked. King Cailan believes another blight has begun, darkspawn are pouring towards the surface, and somewhere amongst them is an archdemon capable of turning those creatures into an organized army. The Grey Wardens have dealt with this before, Ferelden hasn't. So Cailan gathers his forces at Ostagar, preparing to meet the darkspawn before the blight can spread. This is where Origins initially looks like it's going to tell a very familiar fantasy story. There's a king, there's an ancient evil, there's an army of monsters, there's a heroic order responsible for stopping them. You can almost see where the story is going to go. And then Ostagar happens. The battle is a disaster, Cailan is killed, the Grey Wardens are slaughtered, and Alistair and Loghain withdraws his forces rather than reinforcing the king. By the time you wake up afterwards, rescued by Flemeth alongside Alistair, practically everything holding Ferelden together has collapsed. The king is dead, the Grey Wardens have been blamed for his death, Loghain controls the country, and the Darkspawn are still coming. You and Alistair might be the only Grey Wardens left in Ferelden, so now you have to build an army. On paper, that is the entire game. Before Ostagar, treaties were established between the Grey Wardens and several groups across Ferelden. The mages owe you support, the dwarves owe you support, the Dalish elves owe you support. Arl Aemon can potentially help challenge Loghain. So you travel across Ferelden collecting on those promises. Except this is Dragon Age, made by BioWare when BioWare was still good, and absolutely nobody is willing to help you. In fact, thanks now fuck off is the common theme. Redcliffe is under siege by undead creatures, the Circle Tower has descended into chaos, the Dalish are trapped in seemingly endless conflict with fucking werewolves. It's always fucking something with the Dalish. Orzammar doesn't even have a king. Everywhere you go looking for soldiers, you find another society already collapsing under the weight of its own fucking problems. And that's where the real story of Dragon Age begins. Not with the Blight, but with the people. Because the Darkspawn might be the thing threatening to destroy Ferelden, but frankly Ferelden's done a pretty spectacular job of fucking itself into oblivion already. And everywhere you go, this game asks you to become involved. And at first, a lot of it seems straightforward. Redcliffe appears straightforward. The village is being attacked every night by undead creatures. Fantasy trope 101. People are terrified, Arl Aemon is dying, and without him Ferelden has very little chance of challenging Loghain politically. So you help. You organize the defense, you fight through the night, you push towards the castle. And eventually you discover that the source of everything happening in Redcliffe isn't some great necromancer or Darkspawn general. It's a child, because children cannot be trusted. Connor, Aemon's son. Connor has magical abilities. His mother, terrified that the Templars would take him away, secretly hired an apostate to teach him. Then Aemon became ill. Connor became desperate, and something inside the Fade offered to help him. And like any child wanting to save their father, they listened to the demonic entity, and now they are possessed. And suddenly the heroic fantasy becomes uncomfortable, because you need to solve the problem. You could kill Connor, because fuck him, I guess. You could sacrifice his mother, because I also fuck her, I guess. Under the right circumstances, you can seek help from the Circle and attempt to save everyone. But that's boring. What matters isn't simply which button you press at the end. It's everything you've learned getting there. Because Connor isn't evil, his mother isn't evil. Yeah, sure, the demon inside him is probably evil. But even the decisions that created this disaster were made because people were frightened. And when people are frightened, they do silly, dumb things. And Origins does this constantly. Not silly, dumb things, but really makes you think about the decisions you're making. It gives you situations that initially look simple, and then keeps adding context until you're no longer completely certain what the right answer is. And then it makes you choose anyway. The Circle Tower does the exact same thing. Magic in Dragon Age is dangerous. Not like theoretically dangerous, but actually fucking nuclear bomb dangerous. Mages can, and often do, become possessed. In fact, possession happens a lot in this game, thinking about it. Demons can enter the world through them. A single abomination can kill enormous numbers of people. So the Templars exist to watch them. And from one perspective, that makes sense. Until you actually see what being watched means. Mages are taken from their families. They're confined to circles. They're subjected to the harrowing. Those considered dangerous can have their connection to the Fade severed entirely, becoming tranquil. So who's right? The mages who want freedom, or the Templars who know exactly what can happen when magic goes horrifically wrong? Then you arrive at the Circle and see exactly what can happen when magic does go wrong. And once again, Origins refuses to make things comfortable, because you're never choosing between good people and bad people. You're choosing between competing fears, and your companions are watching. This is where the people travelling alongside you become more than colourful characters filling spaces in your party. Alistair has spent much of his life around the Chantry and the Templars, but he also became a Grey Warden and has his own complicated relationship with authority. Morrigan sees almost everything differently, and that annoyingly so at times. She grew up outside society under Flemeth and considers many of Ferelden's institutions absurd. She's pragmatic to the point of cruelty and frequently cannot understand why you're wasting time doing anything other than addressing the fact that there is a blight happening. And I love that for her, because Morrigan isn't waiting for you to teach her how to become a good person. She has opinions. So does Leliana. So does Sten. So does Wynne. So does Zevran. You can talk to them at camp, learn about their histories, challenge their beliefs, become friends with them, romance some of them. Because is it even an RPG if you can't fuck your companions? Looking at you, Baldur's Gate 3. But they aren't simply there to approve of everything you do. Push someone far enough and they can and will leave. They also can and will die. Certain decisions can turn companions against you entirely. Under the right circumstances, people you've travelled with for dozens of hours can end up very dead because of a decision you've made. And perhaps nobody demonstrates that better than Alistair. When you first meet him, he's essentially comic relief. He's awkward, sarcastic, and surprisingly cheerful considering he's a member of an order dedicated to dying horribly fighting Darkspawn. Then Ostagar happens, and Duncan dies, and the other Wardens die, and suddenly you and Alistair are all that's left. Over the course of the game, you learn who he really is. He's the illegitimate son of King Merrick, which means the slightly awkward Grey Warden standing next to you has a legitimate claim to Ferelden's throne. And Origins doesn't immediately turn that into heroic destiny. Alistair doesn't particularly want to be king, which really, if you think about it, probably means he should be. Whether he becomes one depends partly on you. How you speak to him, how his personality develops, what happens during the Landsmeet, who you support. And by the end of the game, your relationship with this one character can completely alter the future of Ferelden. But before we get there, we need an army. And eventually that takes us beneath the mountains to Orzammar. Orzammar is one of those sections that perfectly represents both what is brilliant and what is exhausting about Dragon Age Origins, because it's long. Very long. Why is it so long? That's what she said. Anyway, eventually you're going to spend what feels like half your natural lifespan wandering through the deep roads killing Darkspawn. But narratively, Orzammar is fascinating. The dwarves have no king. Two candidates competing for the throne, Harrowmont and Bellin. And initially the game seems to make this quite easy. Harrowmont appears honourable. Bellin appears like a bit of a cunt. If you're trying to play the traditional heroic character, Harrowmont seems like the obvious answer. Then you start learning about Orzammar. Dwarven society is obsessed with tradition. Its caste system determines your worth from birth. Anyway, the casteless are treated as barely people. The entire civilization is slowly dying while desperately clinging to the systems that help create its decline. And Bellin wants reform. He's still ruthless. He's still manipulative. He's still cunty. You don't suddenly discover that he's secretly a wonderful person. He's not. But the question changes. You're no longer asking which man is nicer. You're asking which man might actually be better for Orzammar. The honourable traditionalist who preserves a broken system, or the ruthless dickhead reformer who might drag it forward. There is no morality meter telling you the answer. There's no giant blue options labelled good, no red option labelled evil. You decide what you value, then the world has to live with your decisions, and that's the rhythm Origins maintains almost all the way through. The Dalish and the Werewolves present another conflict built on history, revenge, and punishment. Redcliffe forces you to weigh innocence against necessity. The Circle asks whether security justifies oppression, and Orzammar asks whether morality in leadership matters more than the consequence of policy. And eventually all of those decisions begin converting on Denerim, because while you've been travelling across Ferelden trying to stop the Blight, Loghain has been fighting a completely different war. Against you, because fuck Loghain. Loghain is fascinating because the easiest version of this story would simply make him a traitor. He abandoned Cailan, he blames the Grey Wardens, he seized power, he spent the game trying to have you killed. By the time you finally confront him, you have every reason to hate him. But Loghain doesn't believe he's the villain, because that's human. Villains rarely see themselves as villains. He remembers Ferelden under Orlesian occupation. He fought to free his country, and from his perspective, Cailan's willingness to work with the Orlais isn't enlightened diplomacy, it's a threat to everything he has worked for. And that doesn't excuse what Loghain does, but it does help explain him. And then Origins does something that only Origins does. After spending the entire game building towards your confrontation with this man, it allows you to recruit him. You can make Loghain a Grey Warden. Think about what that means for other characters, especially Alistair. Duncan is dead partly because of Loghain. The Wardens of Ostagar are dead, Cailan is dead, and now you're suggesting that this man, who is arguably the cause of all of this, should wear the same armor, fight under the same banner. Alistair can walk away. Your friendship with him doesn't magically override who he is, and suddenly a decision about whether Loghain might be useful against the Archdemon becomes a decision about loyalty, justice, revenge, and duty. And then the Landsmeet takes everything you've done throughout the whole game and throws it together. Who should rule Ferelden? Alistair, Honora, both? What happens to Loghain? What happens to you? Your character's origin can matter. Your relationships absolutely matter. Decisions made throughout the entire playthrough of the game matter. And this is where I started thinking less about whether Dragon Age Origins has aged well, and more about what we've actually gained during the 17 years since it released. Because obviously games have become better technically, visually. Look at the faces in Origins and the animations, then look at any modern RPG. Not even comparable. Fucking Baldur's Gate 3. Modern games have enormous worlds, incredible animations, motion capture, cinematic dialogue, and combat systems that feel infinitely more responsive. But I'm not convinced RPGs have consistently become better at letting players interfere with the stories. In fact, I would argue the opposite has happened. Everything has become shadows of its former self. Look at Fallout as a great example and where that sits versus its early iterations as, I would argue, the perfect example of this argument. In fact, look at any of Bethesda's RPGs now versus what they used to be. Because interference is expensive. If you spent millions creating a character, it's difficult to allow the player to kill them halfway through the game. If you spent months producing a cinematic questline, you probably don't want half your audience permanently locking themselves out of it. The bigger these games become, the more expensive genuine consequence becomes. And Origins came from this fascinating moment where BioWare had enough money to create a cinematic RPG, but was still carrying the design philosophy of older CRPGs. So sometimes the game just lets you fuck things up. People can die, companions can leave, quests can end horribly, entire groups can receive completely different futures depending on what you decide. And the game doesn't immediately reload your save and tell you, oh, okay, let's try again. It just continues, live with it, deal with it, you're bad. That's the difference between being shown a story and feeling ownership over one, which makes returning to Origins after seeing what Dragon Age eventually became particularly interesting. For context, and those that forgot by the way, Dragon Age became, how do I put this, total shit. Just had to really make my stance on that like super clear. Yeah, Veilguard was fucking trash. The series changed. Dragon Age 2 became faster and more focused. Inquisition became enormous, pushing towards the open world structure dominating game design at the time, and eventually Veilguard moved even further towards action combat and, I guess, cinematic presentation. I would just argue it's just total and utter garbage shit game design and philosophy, to the point the scripting made me challenge my decision to ever play games ever again. Anyway, I should probably tell you what I really think about that game in another video. There are things those games do better than Origins, apart from Veilguard. Veilguard's just shit. But playing them alongside one another makes you realize that BioWare's definition of an RPG changed, and perhaps so did ours. Because Origins can be inconvenient. The inventory is fucking shit. Some fights feel endless. The deep roads go on forever. Character builds can be confusing if you don't understand what you're doing. And then there's the fade, the fucking fade. The fade is one of those sections where you can understand what BioWare was trying to do and still desperately wish they'd just stopped doing it like an hour or two earlier. Conceptually, it's interesting, I'll give them that. You're trapped in a dreamlike realm, you gain transformation that allows you to navigate different environments and solve puzzles. The normal rules of the world disappear, but it completely murders the pacing of the Circle storyline, and that's Origins in miniature. Ambitious, complicated, occasionally brilliant, occasionally infuriating, very rarely streamlined. But even the frustrations feel like they came from a studio trying to give the player more rather than worrying that they might become overwhelmed. And eventually, after you've dealt with the politics, survived the deep roads, endured the fade, and assembled your armies, the Blight finally becomes what it was always threatened to become, an apocalypse. Denerim is overrun, the archdemon attacks, and suddenly all those treaties you spent the game collecting become real. The people you helped to hear, the alliances you created to hear, the army standing behind you is partly a reflection of the decisions you've made throughout your playthrough of the game. But before the final battle, Origins has one more decision waiting for you. Because Grey Wardens don't simply kill archdemons, they die doing it. When an archdemon is killed, its soul passes into the nearest darkspawn and is reborn. Grey Wardens prevent that because they've already connected to the darkspawn taint. If a warden delivers the killing blow, the archdemon's soul enters them instead. Both souls are destroyed. The archdemon dies, so does the warden. And suddenly you understand what Duncan was recruiting you for. This was never an order of glorious fantasy heroes. The Grey Wardens exist to make this sacrifice. Except Morrigan offers another way, the Dark Ritual. If a Grey Warden conceives a child with her before the battle, the old god's soul can pass into the unborn child instead. The archdemon dies, the warden survives, everyone wins, probably, except this is Morrigan, so probably not. And you're talking about deliberately placing the soul of an ancient god inside an unborn child. What could possibly go wrong? Depending on who your warden is, you might perform the ritual yourself. You might ask Alistair. You might ask Loghain. You might fuck, Morrigan. Any of the above. Or you can refuse, and somebody will die. Even here, right before the credits, Origins refuses to give you a clean, heroic answer. Victory has a price, and the only question is who's paying for it. And when the archdemon finally falls, that's what stays with me about Dragon Age. Not the combat, not the graphics, certainly not the fucking fade. It's the feeling that the story I reached at the end was partly mine. My warden came from somewhere. He believed certain things. He made friends, he made enemies, he decided who ruled Orzammar, he decided what happened to the Circle, he decided the fate of Loghain, he helped determine who sat on Ferelden's throne, and finally, he decided what price he was willing to pay to end the Blight. Someone else's playthrough could tell a noticeably different story, and that is why, despite everything about Dragon Age Origins that has aged, I think its most important qualities haven't. 17 years later, yes, it looks old. It feels old. It is old. There are parts of it I would happily never play again, but the thing that made it special in 2009 were not its graphics or animations. It was its willingness to ultimately trust the player, to give you information without always giving you an answer, and to create characters who could and would disagree with you, to allow you to make decisions that genuinely made your situation worse, to let you define your protagonist instead of defining them for you, and above everything else, to remember what you did. We've spent 17 years making RPGs bigger, prettier, faster, and more cinematic. I am not convinced we spent 17 years making them better at that. Maybe that's why people are still thinking about Origins. While we're still arguing over Bellin and Harrimont, while people still debate whether Loghain deserved redemption, while people who played the game in 2009 can still remember what happened to their Grey Warden, mine died. And yes, why everyone still fucking hates the Fade. Because Dragon Age Origins is not timeless. It couldn't be. You can see those 17 years everywhere, but underneath all of that aging technology is something that still works remarkably well. A world that doesn't simply wait for you to save it. It asks you what you think it should become, and then it just carries on with your answer. So 17 years later, is Dragon Age Origins still a good RPG? No, I don't think it is. I think it's still a fucking great one. And as always, until next time, something, something, something.